Thank you, Eduardo, for the kind invitation, and of course, thank you for the colleagues on the panel. And I wish to thank you all for taking the time to come here and leave this great weather outside in Madrid and come to this closed room. I'll try to tell you a little bit about how we see what's happening in Egypt, mainly to tell you that this complex story that is happening does not should not be perceived as a story that went wrong, rather than it's a story of a transition that is always complicated, and a road that has its bumps, and those bumps should not discourage us from continuing it and from continue viewing it as a transition towards democracy and a people who are reclaiming their rights and their freedoms and their hopes for the future. I am sure everybody, myself, people in Egypt most of all, but also across the world, when they recall those days in Tahrir with the Egyptians coming together, all types of Egyptians coming together in a very peaceful and emotional way to determine their future, and compare it to those complicated moments we're going through now, are feeling that maybe Egypt has lost its road, that this has this nice Arab spring in Egypt has become a cold winter or a very hot desert summer. What I will try is to show you that this is a very distorted view of the real picture, and that that this is part of a big process, that some of the bumps we're going through are necessary means to reach the end we all hope to have. I think the word spring played a role in this confusion, because spring is a fragile, gentle, and soft process, a moment that passes and possibly is not viewed as strong enough to withstand difficulties. But what's happening in our countries, in Egypt certainly, is not that kind of season. It's a big change in a big country with almost 90 million citizens, with a long history and a complex culture, and quite a few domestic and external challenges. So it shouldn't look like a spring even when things are getting better. What is happening in Egypt has been happening in the last 2.5 years and will continue to happen in the coming months and maybe a couple of years. Is not just what you had to go through here in Spain, building the constitution and the institutions of a democracy. That's certainly happening, sometimes correctly, sometimes with flaws that need to be corrected. But at the same time, the basic foundations of a democracy are being developed, and the consensus on what's the meaning of democracy is being developed. And this is an important process, more historic, more fundamental process that cannot just be negotiated. Societies evolve into answering them. I think big questions like what exactly would be the role of religion in politics, what kind of relationship between politicians and the political rulers and the state institutions, the civilian state institutions, the security state institutions. Those are complex questions that societies answer in an evolutionary process, in a trial and error process. So this is what's happening in Egypt, and maybe at one point, what happened in Egypt, that we might have went a little bit faster in building the institutions and writing the constitution without really being sure that we reach the consensus on some of those questions. And in particular, I have in mind the role of religion in politics. So we might have been a bit hasty in building some of the building blocks of a democracy before answering the fundamental questions. I think the problem of the past year of the rule of former President Mohamed Morsi and the Muslim Brothers was not just that they managed the process strongly, they did, in my view at least, but that they thought they are entitled to construct Egypt in such a way that is consistent with what they believe, and that democracy meant elections, and when you win elections, you have the right to design the state and determine its future. So the basic challenge we're going through is not about who governs Egypt, but most probably how should Egypt be governed. Of course, in politics there is always this competition, sometimes quite heated competition on who governs. But I think the more fundamental problem we had in Egypt, the more fundamental challenge we had in Egypt was how Egypt should be governed, rather than who governs it. A fact that sometimes is overlooked by many observers is that the Muslim Brothers never won a majority after the 2011 revolution. They always won a big minority. They came out the biggest party, but never commanded a majority. The only way they were able to have a majority was by having an alliance and choosing their allies that would broaden their base of support. That was in the parliamentary elections or in the presidential elections, when former President Morsi realized that unless he can get all the more conservative votes from the Salafis and the Salafi parties, but also a significant chunk of the leftists and the liberals, he might not be able to make it to become president in the second round of voting, when there were only two candidates, former President Morsi along with the former Prime Minister General Shafiq. So they never had a majority. However, they acted as if they thought that they got confirmation that they had a permanent majority, that this is the choice, the people choosing them meant that people chose the way of Islam. That mainly is why things started to get complicated. Not just that they were allowed to run the country for a term, a presidential term, which is 5 years, but to design Egypt. And this is something that they even said in the rhetoric. Their leaders kept saying that this is the people's choice. Egyptians will choose Islam anytime they have the chance. I think they believed it, and I think they miscalculated and thought that the vote they got was a vote of principle rather than a pragmatic vote, and I think they were wrong. The turning point, because when former President Morsi was elected, I'm sure there were those who were very angry, and those who did not want to accept this fact. But the majority of Egyptians actually accepted it, including those who decided to cooperate with him despite having voted against him or not voted at all. Many of them decided to accept it. All the political leaders of the opposition were open to cooperate, to talk, and to listen, until a turning point came, all of a sudden, because it came immediately after a sequence of meetings he had with the key opposition figures, supposedly trying to build a consensus on how to approach the constitution, after having promised explicitly, after President Morsi having promised explicitly that he will not present a constitution for a referendum unless it has a consensus. He said it in no uncertain terms. And all of a sudden, on the 22nd of November of 2012, he issued a constitutional declaration, because Egypt did not have a constitution yet. He issued a constitutional decree putting his decisions and all the laws he would pass, because he had the legislative power, beyond judicial review, so he can issue a decree and nobody can challenge it in a court if it contravenes the Constitution, firing the Attorney General and appointing somebody who turned out to be fairly loyal to him, and protecting the Constitutional Assembly from the legal challenges that were launched against it. Those measures, which indicated a desire to prevent any challenge to the course of action in policy and of the Constitution writing process, was cause for very serious concern among the opposition and segments of society that are yet to be determined, at the time were yet to be determined. But resulted immediately in two important developments: the formation of a front bringing together all opposition parties, all opposition non-Islamist parties, because by the time the main Salafi party moved to the opposition but did not join this camp. And the second result was the people coming out in hundreds of thousands in demonstrations, this time close to the presidential palace as well as Tahrir, expressing their anger. Many of us thought that this is, of course, the Cairo community, which was not known to be very friendly to the Muslim Brothers. Significant as it might be, there is still a majority of support. But this wave of demonstrations and opposition started at this moment. The second mistake after this constitutional decree was when the president felt that those demonstrators, the president and the Muslim Brothers, did not like those demonstrations that much, and they thought the police is not doing enough to stop them. A big contingent of Muslim Brothers came to the location and attacked those demonstrators who had camped next to the presidential palace, and physically beat them. At the same time, the vice president publicly, in a press conference, exactly the same time when this attack was happening, said either the demonstrators accept the president's authority, or it will be the survival for the strongest. This will be the rule in Egypt, the survival for the strongest. And this was a worrying signal to many that the resort to force is going to be part of the political game. Then the third big mistake was the writing of the Constitution. And the Constitution that was written was 80%, maybe 80% in my view, a good document, but there were things that were quite problematic to most of the political actors, and I would say many of those who took a more neutral position in analyzing what the Constitution contained. But there were key elements that were particularly problematic, which was the elaboration on what the meaning of Sharia is, because our previous constitutions said that Sharia would be the main source of legislation. But that was narrowly defined to specific elements of Sharia. In the Constitution, they entered language that defined Sharia very broadly and made it very easy to use to overrule what legislation would do, what the legislature would do, and subject Parliament will to the broad, very broad content of Sharia. The fourth problem, and that affected people, normal people working in the civil administration, of course the senior, but also the regular folks, and frustrated the opposition parties, and particularly frustrated the Salafis, was trying to implant Muslim Brothers loyalists and members of the organization in key government positions in the ministries and in the governorates in such a way that made people start to fear that the Muslim Brothers are trying to control the state apparatus in such a way that will make it increasingly difficult to have a real alteration of power as a result of elections by being able to manipulate the political process in the old ways, because that was the old way. The old way was the government didn't have to rig the ballots, not necessarily rig the ballots, they did that of course, but they used even more subtle ways long before in trying to manipulate the process and have the right results from their point of view. And this worried people, and worried people for their livelihood, those who worked in those institutions, but worried those who thought that this would preempt the emergence of a real democracy and might make the idea of elections just an exercise in absurdity. The further mistake they made was trying to introduce legislation using the upper house in which they had a majority, which was still functioning, to write laws that were seen by many as helping them. They wrote, for instance, the election law and drew the boundaries of the constituencies in such a way that others were not pleased at all with. They started writing a law about the judiciary, reforming the judiciary, but many thought was intended to make major change to remove a huge number of judges and open the door for judges from outside the judiciary, lawyers from outside the judiciary to enter and alter the composition of the judiciary. And this, of course, scared people. Another mistake they made was deciding politically in every step of the way to align with the more conservative, the more fundamentalist political parties instead of aligning themselves with the centrist. Since the election of former President Morsi, at no instance they tried to reach out towards the center and the other political parties. They always built their coalitions with the more conservative elements. And the president started to respond to increased opposition, the president and his allies, with attacks on his opposition, on the media, on the judiciary, and claiming that this is just inspired by the former regime and counter-revolution, not showing understanding or respect for the demands and the concerns. This resulted in a groundswell of opposition, attempts by people inside Egypt, including the head of the military, but also including the European Union through Lady Ashton and Ambassador Bernardino Leon, to find ways to bring people together. Failed, and in most cases failed because the Muslim Brothers were not willing to concede ground. They wanted to any ground they managed to obtain, to keep it. The result was a campaign that started in a very insignificant way by three young gentlemen who decided to launch a campaign to remove the president, to call for early elections, which was not enshrined in the constitution. And they designed a paper where people would sign and write down their ID number, calling for the president to be removed, and for a big demonstration on the 30th of June, the first anniversary of the sitting of the president. They called themselves Rebel, in Arabic Tamarrud, and they started this strange campaign. But to everybody's surprise, this petition, the signature of this petition, spread phenomenally in the cities first, and then in the countryside. The kids didn't have to do it themselves, those young men, but people were downloading it on the internet and printing dozens or even sometimes hundreds of copies and going around towns in traffic lights or going through neighborhoods and collecting signs. Political parties opened their offices and saying anyone who has signed petition papers, bring them and we will transport them to the head office of the campaign in Cairo. Celebrities or senior politicians signing it publicly in TV programs to encourage. It was a very interesting phenomenon. But and then the campaign leaders announced the numbers. We had 2 or 3 million, then 7 million, 15, and then a couple of days before the 30th of June, they said we already gathered 22 million. Of course, there is no way to control the figure, but anecdotally, all Egyptians knew that virtually everybody was signing it. Everybody was signing it. As the joke goes, even some signed it twice, but people were signing it massively. The real test was, of course, how the June 30th demonstrations would turn out. Contacts with the senior Muslim Brothers by other politicians in Egypt or foreign leaders showed that they did not think it will be a big demonstration. They said it will be a few thousands. The highest number, someone of them was quoted as saying, said maybe 120, 150,000 will turn out, and they'll go home by 11. The real numbers, I don't know the real numbers. There were all sorts of numbers out. But what I am sure of is that Cairo and the cities and the countryside saw demonstrations that we never saw before. Not even in the January 2011 revolution. Huge numbers. And that was a surprise to everybody, almost everybody, even those who led them, but also to the Muslim Brothers themselves. But the surprise did not result in a reconsideration. At the time, 2 parallel developments were happening. Of course, before the June 30th demonstrations, there were actions taking place on the ground. Demonstrators in different cities and towns in Egypt were blocking Muslim Brothers officials from entering into their offices in ministries or governorates, and demonstrations and counter demonstrations were forming in many places in Cairo and elsewhere, and those escalated to the point that people were starting to attack each other, sometimes in a bloody way, and people were injured, and even people started to get killed. And this was a very worrying, very alarming development. The second parallel process that was taking place were attempts to find a way out of this problem by foreign partners, but mainly by Egyptian actors trying to mediate, find a way. The main player was the head of the military, General Abdel Fattah Sisi. He tried a couple of times privately and a couple of times publicly to help the process find a resolution. First, he made a statement in May saying we should solve those political problems amicably, and please don't ask the military to intervene. This will take us back. So because there were those who started calling on the army to end the problem. And then he made privately an offer to the president telling him, if you accept a cabinet reshuffle and a new prime minister and removing the attorney general, I think I can lean on the opposition to accept that as a deal and forget about the idea of early presidential elections. And he did not accept it. He publicly came out a week before the 30th of June saying, we have a week, we can use it to find an agreement. But of course, nothing changed. After the 30th, he said, now the people have spoken. I hope that the politicians will get the message. I mean the head of the military. And in the next 48 hours, something should happen. But of course, those next 48 hours were very bloody because the demonstrators, many of them, not everybody, but many of them, stayed in the streets and started attacking the offices of the Muslim Brothers, and the situation started to get really ugly, and it spiraled very quickly, threatening to to spiral out of control. And when this did not happen, the head of the military called for a meeting with the leaders of this youth campaign, with the opposition, and they sent a representative in Dr. Mohammed al-Baradei, the former head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, who became a leading political figure and a leading opposition figure. The head of Al-Azhar, the foremost Islamic institution, and the Pope of Egypt's Coptic Church, and the head of the Noor Salafi party, as well as the head of the Muslim Brothers Party, called Freedom and Justice Party. And the head of the Muslim Brothers Party did not attend. They met. The president proposed a referendum. The attendance on the president, the attendance refused the idea, and they insisted on the removal of the president, the appointment of the head of the Constitutional Court as interim president, and changing the cabinet, suspending the constitution, and launching a new process of writing the constitution, followed by elections. To reorder the process, start by writing the constitution, followed by elections. The Salafis insisted it will have to be based on the former constitution, and that was agreed, and that's what was announced. The Muslim Brothers expectedly rejected all that and said that the president was a legitimate president. The president was put in under custody, and the Muslim Brothers started a sit-in. Well, it started a week or so before the 30th of June in 2 locations in Cairo, and those sit-ins started to grow, and maybe in a little while the numbers did not grow that much, but they started to become a source of security concern, because the people saw that they were getting armed, and they were constructing walls that police started to worry they might become they might use this as a center become a security problem, a serious security problem. There are those ideas of a zone that becomes protected and starts getting militarized until it becomes a zone that is untouchable. That's a worry that people in our security feared, and pushed and insisted that the sit-ins should be disbanded. And this is what happened. And when they were disbanded, of course, we also, that was in the middle of August. It was quite a bloody process, but it was bloody on both sides, confirming the fears that those sit-ins became quite dangerous, because 50 of the police officers who went to participate in the disbandment were killed, and many more were injured. If we recall that the police officer is very well protected, very well trained, and armed, can have those numbers of casualties, it indicates how bad the situation was. In any case, this is where we are now. The country is following this roadmap that was decided the very first day of the removal of former President Morsi, which is writing a constitution and preparing for elections, but at the same time trying to deal with this problem that we thought did not exist, that the Islamist parties led by the Muslim Brothers had not totally dropped violence as part of the political discourse. This was something that people observed whenever they demonstrated in the serious demonstrations that are not happening now, but used to happen throughout the months of July and August. They were armed, and they fired arms, and they killed some of the police and even some of the unlucky bystanders. But there were attacks across Egypt. Sinai is a special case, but also in the cities and towns and villages. Nobody knows exactly whether those are Muslim brothers themselves or their allies, but the whole phenomenon is a worrying phenomenon, and made clear that this is one of the two big problems with the Islamist movement that needs to be dealt with. The first, the one I mentioned initially, was that they thought democracy was elections, and not realizing that being elected only entitles you to run the country for a specific period, not to change its nature. The second is that violence was very close to the surface, was not those who used weapons had weapons and were quite well trained to use them and were willing to use them. One would understand that the Muslim Brothers would be furious and their supporters would be furious, but being so ready to use violence was something that people thought would come sometime later, when their elements start to become radicalized with time. But that was not; those were not people who got radicalized. Those were people who were ready, who considered violence one of the elements, one of the tools in the political toolbox. As I said, this started back then in November, when the Muslim Brothers sent their young to just sweep away those who were demonstrating. And there are videos and pictures of those attacks, and whether November ones or the more recent ones, that show that there is this problem. Those are the two problems we have to deal with the Islamists. A more overriding challenge Egypt has to face is one that one of our scholars encapsulated brilliantly, I think. He said that we can't have democracy without the Islamists in Egypt, without the Muslim Brothers in particular, but we can't have democracy with them the way they are. So the challenge is how to navigate this very difficult path of making sure that they accept the requirements of democracy and be part of the process without having them dictate the rules of the process or be ready to force their way into the process. This is the big challenge we are facing, but at the same time, the country is moving along with the political process that is open, and they are invited. They have been invited. They keep to be invited to join the process whenever they decide. Of course, the invitation is extended to those who have not been on the record or condemned for using violence or inciting violence, but they are invited to take part in the process if they decide. But in the meantime, there is a commission that is reviewing the constitution, and the indications are, the promise is, let's hope they stay true to that promise. They will write a constitution that is up to the modern international standards of the constitution, that has rights and liberties that ensure that individual freedoms would be protected, and a political system that is fair, that would not be working in someone's favor against the others. At the same time, the government, and with very, very strong backing, I have to tell you, very strong backing, sometimes too strong backing from the public, to deal with the violence, to deal with the sense of insecurity that people are feeling, not just because of the headlines, but in their suburbs, and those processions of those who feel legitimately angry with what happened, but maybe behaving in a way that is not bringing them a lot of popularity. And the third, of course, is working on the socio-economic challenges that Egypt is facing, because without dealing with the people's needs, the country is in trouble. Just today, the government approved a package of measures that would increase growth, enhance growth, and also reduce some of the burdens on the poorer in the society. We'll see, but my final point I would like to make is Egypt's momentum towards democracy cannot be reversed, and because there is this 65% of the population of the young, the large portion of even older people who believe in democracy and its value, not just as an abstract idea, but or ideal, but as a very practical means to ensure steady management of our country and making it a better country. I think if Egypt and our partner countries manage to resolve this question of relationship between religion and state in a proper way, even if we do it the hard way, because we didn't have an alternative, if we manage to do it and come out of it, well, I think this would be a great service to the Muslim world and to our peoples and to the world. It's not going to be easy, but I personally remain hopeful. I think I should stop here, having talked too much.